Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Conventional Wisdom Podcast, part of the FreedomCast Network. I'm your host, Samuel Vernon. Today is the last installment of my three-part series on Bitcoin and why you need Bitcoin. If you haven't checked out my first two episodes, I highly encourage you to do so. The first episode was just broad strokes. What is Bitcoin? You need to have a general understanding of what it is and maybe why it's important. Second episode is dedicated to getting rid of some of the BS and the FUD and the myths surrounding Bitcoin, because there's a lot, and you have to really understand not only what Bitcoin is, but what it is not. And you need to be looking at Bitcoin with the right mindset and the right reference frame of mind in order to fully understand what it is. And in this episode, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to analyze the US dollar for what it is and directly compare the dollar to Bitcoin. I hope this is an eye-opening episode for everyone, because it particularly is very interesting for most Bitcoiners who go down this rabbit hole. Okay, they always have this some similar story where, okay, cool, you understand maybe what Bitcoin is, it might be a little interesting, and you learn just a little bit more about it. And then at some point in your journey, you are going to have to face the question of, here's Bitcoin, and it's functioning as money, and it looks like it is money, and it's got all these wonderful perks. Well, what is it that we have currently? What is this thing that we have? And let's look at how it functions. And so when you start to unpack this, you become very aware of how Bitcoin and the dollar stack up side by side. And it's very eye-opening. A lot of people come to this moment and there's this big aha moment. And in some ways, it's like describing water to a fish. You know, when you are born into a world of the dollar and it's you eat, sleep, breathe, drink, everything around you is the dollar. You live in this world. And without introspection, without thinking through this, you would never understand just how rotten the economy is based on the core unit or based on the dollar. So that's what we are going to do in this episode. We are going to take a magnifying glass and look at the dollar, and you will see just how it compares to Bitcoin. Now, I have to start out by defining the term fiat currency, because I'm going to use that a lot. Because it means something when talking about the dollar versus Bitcoin. When we talk about like Bitcoin or gold, those are sound monies backed by something that is very, very real. The term fiat means something along the lines of to bring about by declaration. So if I just claim to be an expert in some particular field and I just write that in my bio, then I would be a expert by fiat. I just sort of said that I am, and I hope everybody follows along. Fiat currencies are monies that was declared by a government to say, this is now money, and everybody just says, well, we're forced to use them. And ever since we went off the gold standard, and I think the final nail in the coffin for that standard was in 1971, when Nixon famously said, we will temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. And ever since then, we have had a money not backed by anything, not tethered to reality, and it's sort of ephemeral. It's fiat, and it's only a money insofar as the government forces us to use that money. Well, so that might actually bring up a question as to why in the world did we even get off of a gold standard? Why even adopt a fiat standard? And it's a very good question, because if you might recall that, I can't remember if it was my first or second episode, but I referenced a book that is well known in the Bitcoin ecosphere called The Bitcoin Standard, where the author makes a claim that if you look at the things that function as money throughout history, what you're going to find is the ones that stick around, the ones that end up being the dominant form of currency, always tend to be the hardest to reproduce. And because of gold and its physical properties, it beat out everything else that was relatively easy to mass produce, gold being the more scarce, the hardest one to do. There's a little hole in that if you were to think about this and just say, well, then why do we have fiats? And why did we get off of the gold standard? Why is the US dollar as a fiat currency the global reserve asset? What happened to gold? And that's a very good point, although we'll see it doesn't actually poke a hole in that theory. I mean, given enough time, you will see the emergence of the strongest currency, the one that's the hardest to produce. And we are making the case here that is going to be Bitcoin. But the question of why in the world would you even go off of a gold standard to a fiat standard? It's a good question, because there are some rational reasons why one would do so, why a government would choose that. The smaller of the reasons, gold is very, very difficult to transport across space. It doesn't keep its value across space. If I wanted to move 100 tons of gold from France to the US, a big portion of that is going to be used for security, for transportation and whatnot. But fiat currency, on the other hand, is very, very easy to move around. And if you have a ever expanding economy that's circling the globe and where we're dealing in international trades, then you want a currency that can move across space with relative ease. And so there you have a good reason to swap to a fiat currency system. However, the reason that I suspect is the dominant reason, and the one that we're going to focus on primarily, is the fact that fiat currency allows governments to fund themselves. And so you can see why this is so attractive and why so many governments around the world wanted to adopt this. Of course, you would vote to fund yourself. It's a no-brainer. So there you can already start to see a little bit of incentive and a little bit of the, I guess, motivations behind fiat. Let's break this down a little bit more. Understanding fiat is not too terribly difficult. We already established the motivation, the main reason why you would want fiat. You don't have the money to get done what you want to get done. So you have to get it from somewhere. The people aren't being taxed enough. There is no revenue stream. You don't have the money. You want more money to do something with it. You don't have it. What can you do? In fiat world, you can create it out of thin air. But there has to be some rules to your currency. You cannot simply just willy-nilly snap your fingers and a money with no consequence arrives. It's got to be tethered to something. So how can you create a money out of thin air and also have it tethered to something? The only thing you can do is you can promise to pay back in the form of a new, bright, beautiful future that this newly minted money is going to bring about. So what you're doing is when you create money today, you are promising that it's going to be funded in the right place, and we're gonna build this Tomorrowland future where everybody's got flying cars and space travel and abundant food, and the economy is going to be booming, and that will have justified its creation. Justified not only in its original creation, but we can also pay it back because everyone's going to be rich, of course, in Tomorrowland. That's the only thing that you really have when you print money out of thin air. And already you can see the base assumption that comes with fiat. You cannot escape this. As soon as you enter the realm of fiat currencies, which every single currency used throughout the world today is in, comes with this assumption that the only way to achieve that tomorrow, that economic growth, is through monetary expansion. And how often have you heard this from economists? I hear it all the time. You've got to have, the units of money in a system has to be able to grow with the economy. Okay, that's part and parcel with this fiat system. And it makes somewhat sense, and I can understand it to some degree. Okay, if you are imagining Tomorrowland and everyone is rich, which you want, and everyone, let's say, has a flying car, it only makes sense that there has to be more money in the system for everybody to afford this expensive flying car. It only makes sense as there's tons of money in the future. And then, if that's the case, then it follows that I can borrow some of that money to jumpstart today into that tomorrow. So you are pulling money from the future to pay for things today. And that is where we get the first major glaring element in this fiat system, and it's debt. It cannot exist without debt. It's something that you really have to understand. Debt, when you look around this society and you see so much debt, everyone is tripping over themselves to go get a credit card. Everyone has got to have a mortgage or a second mortgage. You've got to get the car loan and whatever. Debt is part of the fiat system. It's not going away. It's part of it. And in fact, you might even hear me interchange the words dollar with debt throughout this episode. Fiat currency is debt. When you pull money from the future to pay for things today, 30 years, 40, 50 years down the road, when you wake up, you've got to pay back all that money that you created out of thin air. Fiat and debt go hand to hand. And also the idea that monetary expansion goes with fiat in order to achieve the economic growth necessary. Lots of problems with this system. For one, okay, if I lend money to you, say I give you $1,000 for something, there's real risk here because it's possible that you are not reputable. And in which case, if you do not pay me back, then I have learned a valuable lesson. I can no longer trust you. I'm going to have to vet the people that I loan money to. There's also a risk on your part. If you do not pay me back the money in a certain amount of time, then I'm going to go and maybe repo whatever it is that you have or take your collateral or maybe lawsuit or something. There's risks and incentives on both sides encouraging each other to honor the deal of, hey, I'm going to give you money that you don't have and then you are going to pay me back. The government is under no such social contract. They can dish out money to whomever they like, and if that money doesn't come back to them, what do they care? They can print more money. If a bank who bought a bunch of the government's debt and put a bunch of treasuries on their balance sheet all of a sudden goes under, doesn't matter. The government can bail you out, can loan you more money even though you are a failed business, even though you squandered their money. The government will just send you more of it because there is no consequence. There's no risk on the government side. And in fact, all of the risk is on the people side, anyone who's borrowing the money. So think about it. If I took out money from tomorrow to buy a car, that's fine. I have got this car. Now I wake up tomorrow, I would normally have a certain amount of money in my bank I no longer have, but instead I have a car payment. I have a bit of debt that I'm obligated to pay back, but I at least have the car. And that's great. I've got the car. And that's perfectly fine. But again, does not apply to governments because the programs that the government decides to fund, the subsidies, the foreign aid, all of the benefits that you'd think would go to its citizens, I wonder how much as a percentage it actually gets to us. So instead, we, the people, wake up tomorrow, we have a mountain of debt that we have to pay back as a country, which we are paying back via taxes and some other means, which I'll talk about here in a bit, of inflation. But we get almost no reward for it. We don't have any of the benefits. None of the benefits went to us. Instead, it's spread out over other people, over other countries, other foreign aid. And so we don't even have the car. We are just stuck with the car payment. All of the risk is on us. We are the people that are bearing the blunt of all of the government debt. And every time the government decides to pull money from the future to do something with it today, we are left with the payment. That's why I say fiat currency is debt. It is a mountain of debt. You cannot get around it. You cannot escape from it. That is part of it. The whole reason why you went onto fiat system standard to begin with was because you didn't have money and you wanted to create it willy-nilly. You think you're going to bring about this bright, beautiful future, but ironically, what you're doing is when you pull that money from the future to jumpstart today, tomorrow you're going to wake up with a car payment. So you're just a little bit in debt before you even get to enjoy what you have. You have to pay it back. Although I am convinced that within the land of fiat, there is no real scheme to pay back the debt. Because if you think about it, you create money out of thin air. And who are you supposed to give that money back? Whose hand do you put the money into in order to say, well, there it goes, it's paid back? No one. Even if you hand it back to the government, they were the originators of the money. They are just going to just be sitting on more and more money. Really, the only way you can actually pay money back is by deleting it out of the system, burning it, destroying it, shredding it. I don't care. But it's got to go back to the dust from where it came. That's the only way to actually pay back this monumental debt that we have. But imagine, you can't really do that under the fiat system, because to do that would be to take away all of that monetary expansion, thus taking away all of the riches of the world, because in your head, in the fiat brain, economic growth is monetary expansion. And without that monetary units there, well, your economy is going to dry up, because your whole economy is just based on, I need to pump more units into the system in order for anybody to do anything. So you can start to see how in the best of intentions to try and bring about Tomorrowland, all you're doing is giving us debt. The modern slave is not in chains. They are in debt. Just as a quick example, in 2020, the government printed $6 trillion. Out of thin air, they issued 6 trillion monetary units and injected it into the system. Okay, let's just say that the average person makes about $60,000 in 1 year, and they work roughly 50 years in their lifetime. So if you do that math, it comes out to be $6 trillion is equivalent to the working lives of 2 million people. That is our blood, sweat, and tears. Our entire economic life. Imagine the government just snapping their fingers and creating that amount of money from nothing. Kind of makes you wonder why you are receiving that paycheck. You are being paid in that money that they just snapped into existence, and you had to work. Well, we will have to all work our entire economic output from our working lives in order to pay back what they just printed. That's why you hear that phrase, I refuse to work for a money that another man can create for free. That's where it comes from. It's very simple. When the government decides to just create money, and then it goes to another country who, let's say their chief export is, I don't know, textiles. It goes to that country and says, oh, here's a ton of dollars that meant nothing to us because we printed it out of nothing. And we'd love to open up trade, and we'd love to take all of your hard-earned textiles, all of your goods and services. Because I want you to work for me, but I don't want to do any work to paying you, to receiving all of the benefits. That's why I say this game of fiat currency that the government controls is so one-sided, because they have a monopoly on the money printing. They can sit back and create as much money as they want, and then we are forced into labor to create economic goods that they benefit from. It's so one-sided. Just like the morning where you wake up and you'd like to have the car that comes with the car payment, but you don't. You are left with the bill. You are left with an entire lifetime. You and your children and your children's children are left with lifetimes of economic output, hard work, in order to create the exact same thing that the government just pressed a button to create. I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in that system. I don't like to be in that sort of chains. I don't want to be a slave owing my entire economic productive life to morons in Washington, D.C. But that's not the only thing that comes with fiat. As stated before, you cannot have a bright, beautiful future tomorrow where everyone is rich without a monetary expansion. So every time debt is created, every time the dollar is created, again, the dollar is debt. But every time the dollar is created, printed out of thin air. And by the way, I don't mean physically printed. Most of the monetary expansion doesn't come from little green pieces of paper floating around. It's issued as debt, as treasuries, as bonds. But it doesn't matter. It just floods the market with more monetary units. So I say the word print. So every time they print, it increases the monetary supply. That comes with the territory. We already know this. And every time the monetary supply increases, you have price increase. That's called inflation. That comes with fiat as well. It's hand in hand. You cannot have the fiat system without an increase in the monetary supply, which in turn raises prices because everything becomes more expensive. Because the number of monetary units floating around in an economy, they're all trying to chase after the same amount of economic goods. So the rate at which you expand the monetary supply means it's the rate at which more and more units are trying to chase after the same amount of goods. So a cup of coffee that used to cost you $2 now costs you $5 and change because there's more units running around trying to price everything, trying to get a hold of it. Look, if the entire economic output of the US was a slice of pizza, okay, then the number of monetary units measuring that pizza would just be slices. And if you add more monetary units in the system, all you are going to get is just thinner and thinner slices. Yeah, sure, more people can enjoy a slice, but what you're getting is a smaller amount of the pie. And so it's no wonder that you're seeing people, you see them on social media, and you probably have heard personal stories of people struggling to survive because all of their bills are more expensive. Everything included, from rent to eggs to just movie theaters to cups of coffee to everything, is all getting more expensive. Your purchasing power is being eroded from you, stolen from you under the fiat system. That's why a lot of people say that fiat is theft. Not only is fiat debt, which we are all in debt, but it's also theft because it is stealing the money that you worked hard for. You worked hard for that money, which is supposed to represent your time and energy, which you can then convert into purchasing and buying other things that cost other people time and energy. That thing that you decide to store in your bank account is now becoming smaller and smaller and smaller at the same rate that governments are printing more and more and more money in order to try and achieve this bright, beautiful future. This is such a backwards, broken game where they hold all the keys, and you are left with a currency whose purchasing power is being eroded out from underneath you while you are trying to climb out from underneath a mountain of debt. You can see how everything in this economy, everything is stacked against you, all because of the failures of the fiat system, that core unit, that dollar that's supposed to represent something that you can trade for a good or a service. You know, it's in your wallet, it's in your bank account. You think you understand this thing, but at its very core, at its inception, at its genesis, is a mountain of debt and an ever weakening currency. That's what you get with this system. As a quick aside, I didn't really prepare this to expand upon it to make it one of my major points of the podcast, but it's interesting to think about because if a economy is built on a broken, fake money, I wonder how much that bleeds into other people's lives and incentives to create broken and fake things in our society. One quick example might be the stark difference between somebody who just maybe posts a video online of themselves and all of a sudden becomes a overnight sensation and makes millions of dollars for something very, very stupid. Whereas hardworking people that go in and day out and just on the grind, putting in their work, putting in their effort, their economic output, they're making pennies on the dollar. It seems like the incentive structure somewhere along the lines got really corrupted, and I can't help but think it is because of a corrupt money. Because that's what's fueling our society. It's so much. I mean, people, they spend the majority of their waking hours trying to earn more money, trying to chase after more money. And so is it any wonder that an obsession over a money that is at its core fake and broken would lead to a society that is also fake and broken? I don't understand how it could not. I don't understand how can the whole not be broken if its parts are at their core broken. But speaking of broken things in the economy, the dollar is not done destroying our world. If a mountain of debt And ever rising inflation is not enough. And centralization of power to a bunch of idiots in Washington, if all of that's not enough, there is one final turd that the fiat dollar can leave us with. And that is the quality of goods. Kind of piggybacking on what I just said, because it's at its core, you have a broken money, you're going to have a broken market of goods, and things are just not going to be what they ought to be. So, because you have such inflation, even if I put my money in the bank account and day after day or year after year, I just add to it, what it can buy becomes less and less and less. It's not good to just let it sit in the bank. You'll lose your purchasing power. So instead, you're going to buy. So instead of having a lot of money to buy the expensive, nice thing, what you're going to do is you're going to spend the money that you have to buy the cheap, not nice thing. And by doing so, because this money is broken and the incentives are screwed, what you're going to have is you are creating a demand for cheap, fast products. Just look at the world around you and tell me you don't see a world full of cheap goods. Plastic. Our foods are pumped full of preservatives so that they can stay on the shelf and so that they can be made very, very rapidly. So it's low in nutrition. All of our furniture is so cheaply made and thrown together, distributed to everybody. All of this, it just screams to me the quality of life is broken, it's fake, it's plastic, it's low quality, and that's exactly what you're going to get with a money that is broken and fake and low quality. Now look, there's probably some people in your lives, or some people that you know, your family, who you know have done very, very well for themselves, and you're like, well, they're not enslaved, they're not living a poor quality life. You're speaking out of your ass because plenty of people are doing quite well in this system, and you would be right, absolutely. I didn't say you could never achieve or prosper under a fiat system. But for an increasing amount of people everywhere, all over the world, they're finding it very difficult to get by. And it just seems that the longer this fiat system goes on, the more people are being affected, the more people are losing their quality of life, their purchasing power. And it does seem like there are a special few who are doing very, very, very well. Now, I'm not just talking about someone who's opened up a business and maybe is self-sufficient and doing, middle class, doing quite well for themselves. There's no doubt in my mind that hard work can still get you ahead in life. I'm not saying that at all. But I used to hear the argument of the wealth inequality, and I used to cringe because I always thought that was so cliche to say that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and it all has to do with our capitalist system. And while I disagree with a lot of the notions behind that, I will say, though, you have identified the problem absolutely correctly in that argument. And it's not capitalism, though. The solution is not get rid of capitalism. The problem is there is a ever widening gap between the people that are closest to the money printers and everybody else. Because it just is the case that under fiat, it is a centralizing force. The more money that gets printed, it doesn't go to everybody equitably. Your bank account does not increase at the same rate that money is being printed. No, it goes to the people who are right next to the government, the politicians, the big banks, the other wealthy nations. They are the ones to benefit the most because they are closest to the money printers. When the money printers go off and we start printing trillions and trillions of dollars, it doesn't just equitably go around to the whole world to fill everyone's bank accounts equally. No, it goes to a privileged few. And so yes, where does all the quality of the world go? Since everything is being mass produced for the people that are losing their purchasing power, where does that quality go? Yeah, it's going to a certain few places. The wealth, the quality, the control, the power, a lot of this is centralizing because it has to. Under fiat, you will always have a centralizing authority, an ever-increasing centralized authority, because one group has to be in control of how much we're printing. We have to be able to curb inflation. We have to be able to handle the debt. We have to steer us into that bright, beautiful tomorrow, that Tomorrowland, right? The people that originated and decided to bring about the fiat system, they are the ones that are in control of where this economy is headed. Once you understand some of the key concepts of how fiat works and operates, you can start to understand what the heck the Fed is doing when they're raising or lowering interest rates. You can sort of see the game that they're playing when they're trying to pull the levers of the economy to try and steer this into what they might call a soft landing. And I used to believe that it was primarily whatever party was running the government, that they were in charge of how well the economy was doing. And don't get me wrong, I suspect they have a decent amount of influence over the economy. But this economy is so bloated and massive, and our debt is so great. Every direction that we turn to try and curb this thing can only be a bad direction. So when the Fed decides to lower interest rates, what's going to happen? Well, if interest rates go down, what does that do? That encourages more loaning, more money printing. Well, more money printing means more inflation, means our dollar starts to be able to go less and less. Prices rise for everybody, and it kind of sucks for the average person. You can't go out and buy a bunch of things because inflation is running away. Prices are skyrocketing. Not only that, but as more and more loaning goes out, we just start getting more and more new debt. Now, there is one good thing, I suppose, about having runaway inflation is you get to sort of cancel out all the debt that's upcoming. The debt that needs to be paid now, well, you just print money to pay it. Oh, that's fine. The only problem is you just keep going further into debt. It doesn't take a genius to realize that printing money to pay for old debt only causes much more debt in the future. So that's not any good. You can't lower interest rates. Okay, so what happens if you raise interest rates? That should certainly curb the amount of debt that's growing, and it does. But again, under a system that demands there has to be monetary expansion for economic growth, and you cut off that monetary expansion, you're not going to just have no economic growth. It's a plane that runs out of fuel, and you're trying to just maintain altitude. At some point, you can no longer pull back on the throttle. You are coming down. The whole system is coming down. And unfortunately, the rest of the politicians that are in office, they only have 3 options to handle this crisis. You can either pay back the debt, which we don't have. We don't have the money to do it, so it's not an option. We don't have the GDP. Our economic output in this country is not enough to even come close to paying off this debt. It's not going to happen. The other option is you could default. You could simply abandon all the obligations to pay whoever it is that you are indebted to, which is political suicide, and everyone that's in office will never ever choose that option. So the only other option, which is a unique position that the government has, of course, is to print more money just to service the debt. And so that's what you're going to do. That's what you understand, that in this fiat system, once it reaches a certain critical mass, there is no stopping its collapse. It's not going to happen. I understand that maybe early on in the fiat life, it might feel like economics, it might feel like your life is booming because there's so much money flowing around in the system and everybody's being so productive. But after a while, this thing will come to a halt. This economy, the way of life, the dollar, what you can buy with it, everything, everyone's trust in this ever-growing government, it's all going to come to an end. If you ask me, I reject that whole system. I don't want to be enslaved. I don't want to owe someone else money for the rest of my life. I don't want my quality of life to continuously degrade because of a crap money. I choose to put my time, wealth, and energy into Bitcoin because Bitcoin is the better money to adopt, the better money to use, the one that's going to withhold its purchasing power. Not only that, but grow in value, in purchasing power over time. Where the fiat dollar degrades constantly, year after year, Bitcoin only grows in value. You watch as everything else becomes cheaper if you hold Bitcoin. Everything. Food, houses, clothing, transportation, all of it is getting cheaper under a Bitcoin standard. Because as long as you have a fixed number of monetary units in a system, that means that your percentage of that system, what you own, if you have 1 Bitcoin and there's only 21 million Bitcoins ever in existence, you own a fixed percent of that system. So as the economy grows, your amount of money is only going to be eating up more of the growing economy as it grows. compared to fiat, where there is no limit to how much money they can print. So your amount that you own is an ever decreasing portion of the total. You are getting poorer, whereas in Bitcoin, you are getting richer. It's that simple. And now imagine a world where our money gains in purchasing power over time rather than loses it. In our current system, we are de-incentivized from saving up for the big purchases. We have to spend our money lest it lose its value over time. So we are focused on what do we need now? What can we spend it on now? Our time preference is so small. Many of us around the country, around the world, are focusing on what to eat for dinner. That's our primary focus. That's where we're going to be putting our economic power, because we can't afford to focus on anything higher. We would go bankrupt if we focused on anything further down the line. Compared to Bitcoin, if you know your purchasing power is only gaining over time, what does that allow you to do? Not only can you afford things because everything is getting cheaper, but now you can actually plan for a future. Your time preference is so expanded so that you are now planning for the future. People that plan for the future, that actually have their present taken care of. They have their food, they have their shelter, they have all their provisions. Once they start to turn their attention towards a future, what do you think that does for innovation? What do you think that does for civilization? Of course, it means a brighter tomorrow. That's how you bring about Tomorrowland, when everyone is not concerned about what they're going to eat tonight, but instead focusing on what's going to happen, how can I shape the future? That's how you get a better future. That is what Bitcoin will bring. An increased time preference so that people can actually turn their attention, their energy, their economic outputs towards a better future. Another wonderful aspect of Bitcoin is how it's going to shape the relationship between people and their governments. Because right now, because governments have a monopoly on money, they completely control it. Bitcoin came in and completely separated money and state. And so how in the world, if you're a government, how are you going to get any money? Because you can't steal it. You can't take it forcibly from people. You can't print it out of thin air. The only way that governments can actually have money is by the voluntary trade with its people, by providing its people goods and services. And so you might not have an abolition of governments in general, but what you might get is a lot of smaller governments that the size of which are exactly proportional to how well they take care of their citizens, how well they provide services to their citizens, and those citizens voluntarily send their money, their hard work, to the governments. This to me is probably one of the coolest things, and one of the things that made me really focus on Bitcoin was this thought experiment of what's going to happen when governments finally wake up and think, oh crap, we need a lot of Bitcoin. All they can do is print money to obtain that Bitcoin. And so you think, oh crap, they're just going to buy up all the Bitcoin. No, what I suspect is going to happen is they're going to print endless amounts of fiat dollars and go to the Bitcoin mining companies and say, hey, give me a bunch of Bitcoin. And the miners are going to think to themselves, hey, you know what? You don't seem to value or respect your dollar very well, your currency, because you're just printing it into oblivion. And you know what? I don't want to give this money. I don't want to give this Bitcoin to you. In fact, I prefer that you actually provide me a service. And so for the first time in history, governments are going to receive a cold, hard slap in the face by its citizens saying, you know what? You cannot take this money from me, and I know you want it, so do something for me instead. And the governments have no other option. Well, they could mine it. Sure, they could mine Bitcoin, which is fine. It only further values Bitcoin and helps secure the system. But the only way to get it is by providing goods and services. Imagine that world that governments have to do that. It's crazy that we had to reinvent money in order for governments to do that. And sure, I am not deluded to think that governments aren't going to put up a fight and try and stop Bitcoin. I discussed this in my second episode. Of course they will. But really, all they can really do is slow it down for a brief period of time before advertising for a money that cannot be stopped by a government. they're only going to make it stronger. Bitcoin was built to be attacked. It cannot be destroyed, and it only grows stronger with every attack because it has the right incentives. To attack Bitcoin is to self-destruct. To attack Bitcoin is to ban yourself from Bitcoin and go broke in the process. Instead, adopt Bitcoin. Learn how to grow with Bitcoin. Your money, your purchasing power, your life, the quality of it, everything gets brighter under a Bitcoin standard. And so I understand why governments will attempt to stop it because they have control over the money printers, they have control over the power, and no government will ever go down without a fight. But even if Bitcoin were to fail, I am much happier planting my flag on that ship, wanting to go down with that ship in a world where it shares my values, it respects my time and energy, and it gives me control over my own economic future. That is the frontier that I want to live in. And if it happens to lead nowhere, then I will happily ride that ship to the bottom. But thank God that it's prospering and that adoption keeps growing, that hash rate on the mining network keeps going, and that every 10 minutes a new block is found, is mined from the miners. Thank God that more and more of our brightest people who are interested in freedom and economic growth are on the development side, creating new technologies, creating new culture all around this idea, this economic idea of freedom. Bitcoin is the new land of the free. Bitcoin is the shining city on a hill. Bitcoin is this new frontier in which we will all go and prosper as free and sovereign individuals. And so I hope you'll think twice about fiat and the world that it has created, and instead opt into Bitcoin, just in case this thing catches on. Conventional Wisdom is a FreedomCast production. You can visit us at freedomcast.us, or if you'd like to support our work, you can go to freedomcast.locals.com. We'll see you there.